It's official. Matt Canada will remain the Steelers offensive coordinator. Is that the death knell to the Steelers season hopes for next year? Some of us don't think it's that deep, but there are going to be real challenges for him. We'll talk about those challenges here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, joined by Josh Taylor of KDKA TV and 93.7 The Fan. And also, finally, our end of season Stars and Skulls grades. We're rolling them out. We're starting with the Steelers offensive line. It's going to be a fun episode. Let's get into it.
You are Locked On Steelers, your daily Pittsburgh Steelers podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
And welcome to the Locked On Steelers podcast. I'm your host, Chris Carter, bringing you your daily dose of all things of the Pittsburgh Steelers. As always, you can find the show on Apple, Spotify, Google Podcasts, Odyssey, and YouTube. If you're watching this video on YouTube, hit the like button on the video if you enjoy it. Hit the subscribe button on our YouTube channel to get all of our daily Monday through Friday episodes, as well as our bonus episodes. We thank you for making the Locked On Steelers podcast your first listen every day. Today's episode is brought to you by Prize Picks. Prize Picks, of course, is daily fantasy made easy. Just pick 2 to 5 players that you think you have a beat on their day in fantasy, and if they score more or less than their Prize Picks projections, and that's touchdown, yards, points, whatever, you can win up to 10 times your money on any entry, and it takes literally less than 60 seconds to enter. So go to Prize Picks. You'll love it, just because, and we did too. First time users receive a 100% instant deposit match up to $100. Promo code Locked On. That's prizepicks.com. Promo code Locked On. As I said before, we're joined by Josh Taylor. Josh, how you doing today, sir?
I'm all right. I'm in college basketball mode. I'm starting to catch up with you as far as getting into the swing of college basketball season. Now that football is finally has totally taken a backseat to everything. I'm in announcer mode, getting ready for another Duquesne women's basketball game to go call that, and ready to see how the season goes. Both programs, men's and women's, are doing pretty well. Pitt's having a pretty good season on the men's side, so I'm kind of getting locked in and starting to have a lot more fun keeping up with what's going on the college basketball side of things.
Absolutely. And I think it's kind of funny when, we're talking about, you think things, first of all, the man is you're a man of many talents. We start to roll into other seasons, but sometimes the Steelers and football still rule even when they're not playing the news day. And that became the case as on Wednesday when my partner of mine, Jerry Dulac, he covers the Steelers, longtime Steelers reporter for the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. And he reported from his sources on Wednesday that Matt Canada was going nowhere. The Steelers had plans to keep him in place. That was then supplemented by reports from prior to ESPN, who said that Bert Lawton, the Steelers head PR guy, he had confirmed that Matt Canada is staying. So the Steelers offensive coordinator position will remain the same. No Pep Hamilton, no Jim Caldwell, no Frank Reich, whoever you wanted. They're not coming here this year. But I do think that there's a lot of people that are going to be talking about this, and there's going to be a lot of negativity because, the Steelers, you look at their points for, their yards gained, they're not good. 26th in points for this year, 23rd in yards. Did limit turnovers, but ultimately you still want to see most. They threw the least passing touchdowns in the entire NFL. Last year, of course, was also Canada's first year as the offensive coordinator, where they finished 21st in points, 23rd in yards overall. Still not, none of this has been good. And you look at those stats, but as you and I pointed out all season long, there was progress as the season continued. The run game emerged, and you saw the efficiency of the offense to get down the field improve. And that's where the Steelers found their best. They finished 7th in third down percentage, 5th in time of possession in the NFL. And there was something to say for that because both of those numbers weren't looking too great 4 or 5 weeks into the season when Kenny Pickett made his first arrival. Josh, is Matt Canada staying this terrible thing that's being made out to be? Is it bad, or is it bad but not that terrible, or is it actually kind of a good thing that they're sticking with continuity here?
Depends on who you're asking. To be quite honest with you, it's crazy because you and I have both talked about what we thought this offense would be. We both talked about the expectations and how they had shifted after they went from Mitch Trubisky to Kenny Pickett. And then we've talked about what it's become. But there are people from the very beginning who didn't want to hear it. They didn't want to hear it coming into this season. They didn't want to hear it last season, and they don't want to hear it now. So I'll say this, and this is going to make some people unhappy. I'm not surprised at all that this stayed ceteris paribus. I'm not surprised. And I have a couple reasons behind that. But do I think it's a great thing perception-wise? Outside the organization, perception is bad. Do I think it's a good thing inside the building? If you listen to what the players tell you and how their feelings about this offense and what it's done at the end of the season compared to what was going on even before the bye week and then after the bye week and then up to this point, if you're listening to what the players tell you, they seem to be okay with this because you had guys like Najee Harris that were vehemently backing Matt Canada. Mason Cole was backing Matt Canada. And here's the guy that you have to pay most attention to. We could take Mike Tomlin's words and set them to the side. The guy who I think gave the most ringing endorsement and probably pushed everything over the edge as far as keeping Matt Canada, as far as people who supported him, and people are going to hate this, but Kenny Pickett was a vast supporter of Matt Canada toward the end of the season. And he gave Matt Canada a lot of credit for his development toward the end of the season. And he was on Cam Hayward's podcast, and he talked about how he gave Matt Canada, Mike Sullivan, and he gave Brian Flores credit for how he developed toward the end of the year. So the fact that you're seeing that kind of vote of confidence from the quarterback, that kind of vote of confidence from the running back, and that kind of vote of confidence from a couple of guys in the offensive line that said, look, we sat down during the bye week. We hashed this whole thing out. We understood exactly what we need to do and how we need to do it and how we can win games, and things started to sort themselves out. You hear all those things. None of them sounded to me when you heard from the players as if a change was going to be made. Yeah. But I'm going off of what the players say. If you go off of what's being said outside the building, you're going to get 4 or 5 different answers, and none of them are going to be good. If I'm going off what I've been told, and you and I, we go off what we've been told. We go off what we hear from players. We go off what we hear from coaches and things of that nature. If we're going off the information that we get, then we're only led to believe that he was going to stay here because there weren't that many negative responses from inside the room. And the people will tell you, well, how much will players really tell you? Well, remember the quarterback that used to be here that kind of had no problem telling us how he felt about the play calls and his 2 previous offensive coordinators? I mean, maybe it's just me. Maybe it's a different breed of athlete. I don't know. But based on what the information we got, it didn't surprise me at all. I guess that's the thing I'm saying. I'm sure it's making some other people crazy. I'm sure my colleagues over at 93.7 The Fan are outside marching around the parking lot with signs. But hey, if you want to go by what we saw from this team after the bye week and what they did offensively, the number of points they scored started to go up a little bit. The efficiency with turnovers started to go up a little bit. The efficiency on third downs really took a big jump. And I think that's why you saw more progress with this offense, because they stayed on the field longer. They got longer drives. They were in the ball better. They were better down the stretch in the second half of games. Did they still start slow in the first half? Yes, but as the second half went along and the running game continued to move, they started wearing teams down and they started closing games out better. And opportunities where the game was close and they had to rely on Kenny Pickett to go out and win it for them, they did that too, as opposed to what was happening earlier in the season. So all those things. And this isn't just in my opinion. This is all on black and white and on paper. It's all proven that they improved over time. So I'm not surprised at the lack of a change. I'm sure I'll go outside my front door and I'll hear about it over the next few days.
Yeah, no, I feel you. It's going to be a loud sounding board point that I think a lot of people are going to continue. I mean, it's not going to be anything new. It's been said all since week 3 of the season. Heck, before the season started, people were calling for Matt Canada's head. And you and I talked about going into this year that a lot of the concepts that he deploys or he uses in his schemes are not, people call it a Saturday offense. I think people got used to just saying that just because a couple, popular people said that. And
they're showing exactly how much they don't know about offense in the National Football League.
Right. And this has been you and I's point all along. A lot of NFL offenses are coming from college concepts. Andy Reid lives off of them. And it drives me nuts when we talk about offensive play calling like there isn't the quarterback option. came from college. The way the air raid, the spread, a lot of that stuff. I'm about to cuss because it's just like like I sit there and when you put that off for months and months like we have, Josh, and you keep hearing it and you keep hearing it and you keep hearing it, it eventually just comes out like please say something that is actually built on knowledge, that you actually shows that you study the game. So many college concepts are being brought to the NFL because they're being experimented with there by the players who eventually get to the NFL, and they are finding success here. Not all success, not everything's to hit success. Look at Cliff Kingsbury. Look at a lot of the guys who come in and fold. And Matt Canada may fold as well. It may not work out, but the idea that too much college plays are the problem, that's just misplaced blame. We're going to keep going on this subject, Josh, but I got to get to our first ad break here or my producers will kill me. But we're sticking with Matt Canada. Like I said, we will get to our offensive line season end grades. So stick with us here on the Locked On Steelers podcast because, Josh, I got to get more of your thoughts on this because we're not done talking here. But first, before we do any of that, we got to talk to you guys about BetOnline. BetOnline is, of course, your number one source for all your betting stats and sports information. Find all the latest sports developments, league reviews, and news, including this year's NFL playoffs. The divisional round is coming up this weekend. You can get ready for it and all the bets that you need to make by going to BetOnline right now. But if you're not interested in that, you also have the NBA, the NHL, college sports, MLB, all of that right there on BetOnline, your continued source for all your sports wagering information from live betting to playoffs, esports, and more. Head to the website today or use your mobile device to learn more of the trends in the action when you visit BetOnline, where the game starts. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, I'm Chris Carter. He's Josh Taylor, and I'm not red hot anymore. I just needed to let that out, Josh, because we've said it so many times, and it seems like people, anyone's like, oh yeah, that is the truth, and then like the next day, it's like, but this is a college offense. It drives me nuts. But
I just let you go because you weren't saying anything that I wasn't going to say myself, so I was just going to let you have it. You were doing all right.
I just think here with Matt Canada. I think that if you want to point out that, you know what, they haven't found success, sure, you're absolutely right. The bottom line results of the offense have not been good. But if you're going to say that and ignore that last year, his first year as offensive coordinator, he had the worst version of Ben Roethlisberger we ever saw. He had an offensive line that was worse than this year's offensive line, as this year's offensive line did improve, but they weren't good at the start of the season. And we'll talk about that in our grade segment in just a little bit. He had a bunch of rookies and second-year players to work with, and needed to develop a rhythm. And and again, his rookie quarterback didn't start till midweek 4, and then it took time for him to get his feet under him. A lot of those are circumstances that I just feel like if that's what you and if you like, imagine if you had that job and you came into that situation and things didn't work out for you. I'd like to think that people would be able to be empathetic enough to be like, you know what, that isn't the best circumstances to get you to show exactly what you got. Now, next year, I think this needs to be the sign of progress. He doesn't have to hit top 10, but get above 16 in the NFL. Like get in that range where reasonably you're a little bit better. You're in the upper part of the middle pack of NFL offenses. It's not, you do that and the defense stays the same, the Steelers will be a very competitive team. Josh, what do you need to see out of Matt Canada to be like, hey, this is working in 2023?
The thing I need to see the most, and we can sit here and talk about, they need to scheme this and find receivers open. Okay, when you tell me that, first of all, when you tell me they're not scheming guys open, that tells me you don't watch all 22. That's the one thing that tells me. So I don't care about concepts being run and what has to happen as far as these guys getting open and things like that. For me, score points. That's it. Your offense has one job. Your offense's job is to attack. And the only way you can attack in this game that's tangible, that leads to winning games, is scoring points. You need to score more than 20 points a game. You need to do it consistently. It doesn't need to be something where it's like the high water mark of a 4-game stretch. It needs to be something that's not even an expectation. It needs to be something that just happens. You need to be looking at scoring 24, 25 points a game. And even that is a modest number. It's not even like it's a huge number to do that. But if you do that, you'll find yourself in the upper parts of the league, or at least near the middle. You'll find yourself even along like the median or mean number for points scored in the game. If you get there, I think the rest of this kind of gets pushed to the wayside. Now, of course, we're saying this with the expectation that this defense is going to be either ceteris paribus or hopefully even better as far as the number of points they allow. Remember, they finished the league 10th in points allowed. So there's that. So if you could have an offense that scores you consistently between 24 and 26 points a game, you're talking about a team that goes from 9-7, that might be 12-5, because there was a difference in 5 or 6 of his games this season where it was a one possession game and just maybe one possession that gets in the end zone, maybe one fewer turnover. Again, the case of Baltimore and Miami and the Jets and New England, one fewer turnover, one possession that ends in points wins you those games. And now we're talking about a team that's 13-4 as opposed to 9-7. That's the difference. So if you can get one extra possession that gets you in the end zone and still maintain the position that they maintain toward the end of the season of minimizing those turnovers, just scoring an extra possession a game, you'll see how much different and how much better this offense looks. And on top of that, I will say this, a couple tweaks in personnel wouldn't hurt either. Some tweaks on the offensive line, maybe the addition of another wide receiver or two. I wouldn't mind seeing maybe another face in the backfield. We don't know what's going to happen with Derek Watt's situation. If that's the case and he departs, maybe Connor Hayward starts to take on that role. So there are going to be some tweaks as far as personnel, and I expect them. But as long as that end result is more points on the board, then that's what I'm looking for.
Just for an example of what Josh is talking about with, if they can average 24 points per game, the median of the NFL at 16th, or tied for 15th rather, because two teams did it, was the Falcons and the Giants, who averaged 21.5 points per game. The Steelers averaged 18.1. If you can, Josh is right. If you can consistently get over that 20-point hump and get in there, you're going to be in that conversation. But if you can average around 25 points per game, then you are talking about being a top 10 offense. Because like this past year, you look at the rankings of teams, 24.9 was the average amount of points scored by the Vikings offense this year, and they were 7th best. So if they're in that conversation, I mean that's ahead of the rate of the Bengals. Actually, no, it's not. It's just a little behind technically because the Bengals actually played one last game. That's a weird thing, but math wise. But point being, Matt Canada, that's the barometer that I think that you're looking for. Average more than like 3 touchdowns per game. I think 21 plus is where you want to see them averaging. And like you said, not 3 and 4 game bursts where they hit on something, but stay consistently above that range, because we've seen the Steelers have won a lot of their games this year by keeping teams under 20 points scored. And the last 2 years, really, when you look at it, heck, the last 4 years, they've done it a bunch of times.
Dating back to 2019, Chris. Dating back to 2019.
Exactly. And if the Steelers can defense maintain that kind of pace, Josh is right. They'll be winning a lot more football games. But like he also said, Josh, we also need to look at the offensive line is one of the biggest parts. We're going to do the grades. Now, all season long, I've been doing my grades on the Tuesday episodes of the Locked On Steelers podcast. You remember them if you've been here all the time. Stars and skulls, 1 to 3 stars for good to great play, 1 to 3 skulls for bad to terrible play. Those were our ratings all season long. But it took me time. I've been tabulating them, and I'm starting to put them together, all my season-long grades for all the position groups. So we're going to start going that, and we're going over the offensive line. And what we're going to do is we're going to go from left to right. So starting with left tackle, work all the way to right tackle in all our grades this season. So for the first grade, and this is where we can start to evaluate, the Steelers' offensive line did get better. So where do they need to get even better next year? And starting with the left tackle, that might be the spot, because when I look back at grades, you had Dan Moore Jr. I gave him 9 different. He had 9 different stars throughout the year. Some of those were it really picked up for him in the second half of the season. But those 15 skulls that you see on the list, I gave him a final grade of a D. I didn't have any creative way to do stars and skulls for amassing like averages and things like that. So I wanted to make this plain and simple for our viewers and listeners. But I gave him a final grade of a D because basically 6 more skulls than stars on the year. And the thing here, Josh, was when I look back at my grades, most of the negatives came at the beginning of part of the season and came heavily. He had about 3 times in 4 weeks. I gave him 2 skull grades. going into the bye. But then after the bye, he only had 3 bad weeks. The rest of the weeks were pretty solid there. I think the other problem was he had like a few good games. The Panthers, the Raiders, and the Ravens games in back-to-back weeks. He had really good performances that I gave him 2-star grades for. That was his best stretch, but a lot of inconsistency around that and flaming downwards. I think Dan Moore Jr. deserves a lot of credit for the growth that he's shown, Josh, but I also think that he's the one that still needs the most growth out of the 5.
I'd agree with that. And we're talking about what, Dan Moore? It was his second season, if I'm not mistaken. Or was it second or his third?
This is his second season. He was a rookie last year.
So this is one of those things where I look at a guy like Dan Moore and I say, okay, you find, just remember what he did in his rookie year to what he did in the second season, how he ended his second season. I'm willing to give Dan Moore a little bit more rope because, like you said, there are days when Dan Moore, you don't hear his name at all because he is doing his job very well and very consistently. Then there's some times when it's like, man, Dan Moore got whooped on those 4 or 5 plays in a row.
Yep.
He sticks out. But I'm willing to give that guy a little bit more rope because, like you mentioned, second-year player, second-year tackle, and playing left tackle in the NFL is not easy, especially when you start as a rookie and then you start as a second-year guy. And it wasn't like he was a first-round pick that he was like, it wasn't like he was a 9th overall pick like Mike McGlinchey in San Francisco. No, this is not that situation.
No,
he's a day 3 guy. So this is not, this is not an ideal situation for a guy coming in to start at left tackle. So you give him a little bit of latitude. And I've been willing to do that. And I'm willing to do that again for one more year. I'll agree with you. I thought Dan Moore's end of the season looked a lot better than his beginning and middle of the season. You hear the old cliche, it's not how you start, it's how you finish. And he's a perfect example, I think, of just the job Pat Meyer did with this group as a whole, because it raised the level of, maybe not so great to, okay, maybe they're looking more like at an average level across the board. But I think Dan Moore was a big example of that.
Absolutely. And again, I think Dan Moore Jr. deserves credit for the growth that he showed. And I think that if the Steelers had other strengths on the roster right now, like if they were built in a lot of other positions, you could live with Dan Moore. But the problem is that with the way the Steelers are built right now, they need this offensive line to be a top-tier unit. They need to develop into that over the next few years. And Dan Moore Jr. can be part of that, but they would need to then get rid of other guys. When you look at the grades of these other guys, you start to question, are they the ones we need to improve the most? Are they the guys that we need to get rid of? Or does Dan Moore Jr. need to be the guy that we bring in more to supplement his position? And look, guys have fought back for their positions before. There's times where you bring guys in, what was it? Hubbard, Chris Hubbard for the longest time. He was a guy that a lot of people thought could have been the starting offensive tackle for the Steelers. Bounced around bounced around the line a bit and eventually got used. I think that's what could be coming for Dan Moore Jr. If he can prove that he's an extremely versatile lineman by flipping left to right tackle, or maybe even some guard play in the offseason. If the Steelers do go and get someone to replace him, he'll still be valuable. He'll still have an NFL career, and he'll probably put himself in a position where the Steelers could be looking and after next year's being like, hey, remember that guy who started for us before? He's been pretty good as a backup, and he probably filled in a couple games for them. Well, who wants this guy, or does he stick around as a depth piece? Because the Steelers' offensive line, no starter missed a game this year. I think that was huge for them all season long. You cannot bank on that for a second time. So there's Dan Moore Jr.'s grade. Let's move over to his partner, the left guard, Kevin Dotson. I gave him a C+ on the year because he earned 15 stars but 13 skulls. And it's very interesting when you go back and you look at how he performed week to week when I was looking at these grades here, Josh, because he did have some really rough weeks. And I think that his roughness got a little bit deeper than Dan Moore Jr.'s at the start, because I had him with -2, or I had him as 2 skulls against the Jets, 3 skulls against the Bills and against the Buccaneers. And at that point, we were all starting to question, is Kendrick Green going to come up into this conversation? But especially after the bye, he turned things around. He only had 2 skull grades after the bye week, and he hit a really strong streak at the end of the season. Between week 13 to the end of the season, the season finale with the Falcons, he had a 2-star grade, against the Falcons, 2 stars against the Panthers, Raiders, 3 stars against the Ravens, 1 star against the Browns. He finished really strong. So the biggest thing, I giving him a C+ here because he was 2 stars over his skulls. Biggest reason I see there is that his highs got pretty high, and they ended up kind of balancing out his lows at the beginning of the season. If he can start hot next year, he could be an answer for you on the line. But that's another question. Do you want to go with a guy who's also a fourth-round pick? He'll be a fourth-year player this upcoming season, or do you go and get somebody else to say, you know what, we appreciate your efforts, Kevin Dotson, but we need a guy who's going to be that all season long?
I think there needs to be an effort to just address the depth on this offensive line. And I think that's one of the things you do. You bring in a guy, if for no other reason, he is either competing for a spot or he is at the very least providing you depth. I think this is important. And I think Kevin Dotson is one of those guys that is probably sink or swim in that regard. If you bring in another guy that can play left guard, whether you draft him in day 1, day 2, or maybe you sign maybe a second tier guy in free agency, bring him in to compete with Kevin Dotson and say, okay, as Mike Tomlin says, 2 dogs, 1 bone, and see what happens. Because I didn't even – now, bear in mind, I have not looked at your numbers before we sat down for this show as far as the number of skulls and stars that you had. And the thing I had in the back of my mind for Kevin Dotson was his highs were really high and his lows were really low. And one of the things I come back to is – and this is both for him and Dan Moore – if you want to talk about the things that need to improve and the things that cannot happen, you cannot allow your quarterback to have the same issues where a linebacker's coming free and getting to your quarterback and your quarterback ends up concussed. That is an absolute no-no. And the fact that it happened twice, that's bordering on cardinal sin. So that's the line we're walking here as far as, okay, you're really down. If you're Kevin Dotson, you're probably down to your last shot to prove just how much it's worth it for this team to do business with you, because there's some things you cannot allow moving forward, because they know now that Kenny Pickett is the starter. They know now that the driving force behind this offense is going to be what number 8 does. So protecting number 8 at all costs is going to become a high priority. And if you are not capable of doing that, then you might have to go find a new line of work, or as Chuck Noll used to say, you might need to go about your life's work, because that now becomes the greatest priority with this offense. If we're talking about Kenny Pickett developing and being that guy, and if we're talking about this offense scoring more points, that guy's got to be on the field. So protecting him becomes an important thing, whether you're Dan Moore Jr. or you're Kevin Dotson.
I agree. We'll get to the rest of these offensive line grades. We got Mason Cole, James Daniels, and Chukwuma Okorafor. Who got the highest grades of those guys throughout the season? We'll do that and a full recap of all those numbers and what it means for the Steelers offensive line in just a bit here on the Locked On Steelers podcast. So don't go away. But first, we got to talk to you guys about Built Bar. Built Bar is, of course, the ultimate protein bar that tastes like a candy bar. If you're trying to work off all the fat and the calories, but you still need some tasty snacks, this is where Built Bar comes in handy, because they come in amazing flavors like churro, peanut butter, brownie, coconut, almond, and they're all covered in 100% real chocolate. And when you eat all those flavors and all that chocolate, all you're eating is 130 calories, 4 grams of sugar, but you're packing in 17 grams of protein. It's a great option for you, and you don't need to wait around for a box anymore. We used to always promote on this show, if you wanted to order them, you had to go to built.com and order them, and they get delivered to your door. Now you can get them in the store. That's right. Head to your nearest Walmart or your Sam's Club to get some Built Bars. Walmart, you walk to their pharmacy section, you can grab yourself a box of Built Bars by picking up a 4-bar box of cookies and cream, double chocolate, or coconut puffs. Or if you're close to Sam's Club, run in and grab a 13-bar box with hit flavors like brownie batter and churro. Trust me, you'll love Built Bars when you try them, and you'll thank me later when you're feeling the results of eating something healthy but very tasty. Back here on the Locked On Steelers podcast, Chris Carter here with Josh Taylor from KDK TV, 93.7 The Fan, also announcing games at Duquesne, where he is wearing his polo right now. But let's get back to these grades real quick. So we went over Dotson and we went over Moore. But let's go to the center, because Mason Cole was looked as a guy who was going to have to stabilize the offensive line this year as a veteran presence. And Josh, I think he did just that. And I think the grades reflect that. When I went back over all my grades from on the season, I gave him 15 stars and only 5 skulls on the year. That was good enough for a B grade in my book. And I really liked what he was putting together. When I went back over all the numbers and confirming what I was good, there was never a point where he was terrible in a game. The worst that he was, well, he lost some matchups and he just had some bad moments and never got to redeem himself. But by and large, game after game, he was either solid and not a liability, or a really good player. And that picked up especially after the bye week. Where after the bye, he only had one game where I gave him a skull. Every other game, he had either one skulls, two skulls, and he even had three skulls against the Carolina Panthers. I think Mason Cole, he was a guy that was looking to prove that he could be a starter, for more than just being a bridge guy in the NFL. And I think he showed that, hey, the Steelers, they can rely on this guy, and center doesn't have to be a position that they draft specifically for or look for again in free agency.
Yeah, I felt that as the season went on, especially after the bye week, I saw the differences in the run game and how the run game was blocked. I think it was the game against the Saints, really, where I thought the light went on for Mason Cole. And I think there was a couple different things. I thought the way that they kind of changed the structure of the run game. They started using a little bit more pistol. They started using a little bit more zone read, and they were finding more ways to get Najee Harris north-south. And I think that was beneficial for two reasons. One, I think it was beneficial for Najee because it forced him to, see the hole a little bit better and hit it harder.
Yeah.
But I also think it was beneficial for the offensive line because it really forced them, hey, we got to get a push here. And it was really more of a do or die type situation. You got to win one-on-one. And this group started doing it more consistently. But the guy that I thought became really, and if not the most consistent in winning one-on-one matchups was Mason Cole. I thought that really improved over time. I thought his influence as an outspoken guy in the locker room, I thought that was felt more. You can easily tell that he was the guy that had really stepped out in front to become that figurehead. He had become the leader of this group, even though we saw him and James Daniels kind of both, emerging as those guys early on when this team started to come together. But as the season wore on, you saw Mason Cole really start to assert himself and step up front. Yeah. Not only is the leader in word, but in the leader in deed also.
No, absolutely. I thought that he was a guy that when you looked at things, because the center, even beyond just winning your matchups, it's coordinating, it's seeing things, it's communicating to the quarterback and communicating down the line. Hey, this is what's going on here. This is their alignment. We practiced against those. But I agree. I think he stabilized things. Now, I gave him a B for that, but the guy, the highest grade goes to the next guy down the line, and that's James Daniels. I gave him 16 stars, and when I look back, I only had 2 single games where I gave him 1 skull grades. He was either kind of just a neutral player or a really good player all season long, and especially as the season wore on for the Steelers. Josh, when I went back and looked at my grades, the first few weeks of the year, I didn't give him a star or skull because I felt like he was kind of just middle of the road. Like he wasn't getting crushed in matchups, but he also wasn't crushing anybody. And I was just like, I'm not so sure how to feel about this. And going into the bye, he had 2 skulls with only 1 star and was kind of looking like, okay, maybe this is kind of just an average signing. But man, after that bye, he was consistently getting a star grade. And then especially in the last 4 weeks when they started to figure out the run game for real, he was spectacular. He had back-to-back 3-star performances against the Panthers and the Raiders, then back-to-back 2-star performances against the Ravens and the Browns. And that was coming, those 4 weeks back, 4 straight weeks of that were coming off of 5 straight weeks of having 1-star performances. So for me, James Daniels became the most consistent force on this offensive line, who also peaked a lot more often, I think, than anyone else. So, as far as free agent signings, he was a very good one for the Steelers this year, in my opinion.
Yeah, I look at James Daniels and how he performed this season as, you don't want to call it the ideal, but if you need a starting point for what you expect out of your lineman on a regular basis, as far as, maybe the minimum level of performance, I feel like James Daniels is that starting point, because if you can have your low end be his low end, where it's like, okay, he might be, he might have his days where he's not killing you, but he's also, not spectacular, but he's there. He's consistent. He's doing everything he can. If that can be your low end and have everything else kind of cycle its way upward, you're going to feel better about that. But here's the problem. When that guy is your best guy, that's when it becomes an issue. When your best guy is the guy that, okay, the low end is average and then it looks better, that's what makes it look a lot worse on the whole. So the fact that he had the best grade, okay, that's great. But what are you grading him against? So yes, like you'd love to see more performances like James Daniels. This time next year, I'm hoping more guys look like what he does now, and then that sets the bar for what you expect to move upward. So yes, from the progress standpoint, I love it. And you love to see more guys graded like what he does this year, next year and hoping you're seeing him and the Mason Coles of the world graded even better.
Absolutely. Last guy on the list here, Chukwuma Okorafor, of course. I had mixed reviews on this because I felt like there were times that he kind of held down the fort, especially early in the season. I felt like he was their best offensive lineman. The first few weeks, he was the one that you couldn't look at and be like, well, he did something bad there. But as the season wore on, he never, and this is why I think Chukwuma Okorafor is such an interesting player for them. I gave him 9 stars, 8 skulls. It's only 1 star above skulls. So I gave him a C grade, just behind Kevin Dotson, honestly, because Kevin Dotson had a lot of highs. And Chukwuma Okorafor did have 1 3-star game against the Panthers. And he never had lower than a 2 skull. He never had lower than a 1 skull game. So he never had 2 or 3 skulls in the game. So he was never the thing that killed them in a game. But the problem was, when I was looking back over it, there were just multiple weeks, several weeks, in fact, 8 weeks, where he was, a negative. He had a bad moment that he never redeemed himself for and wasn't a controlling factor for the Steelers. And for me, that's, it's not terrible, but also he's not your game changer. And he's making a significant amount of money next year for the Pittsburgh Steelers. And this isn't saying that they should fire him or they should, that they should consider that. But, I think that when the Steelers are looking at Chukwuma Okorafor right now, he's going to cost $13 million against the cap. $13 million for basically kind of average offensive tackle play could be kind of rough on the roster that you still kind of need to reform a bit. And I would expect maybe some readjusting of that contract, restructuring to see how that goes. But that contract was also designed with the intention of giving the Steelers some backup plans, because even though he's a $13 million cap hit, only 6.1 of that is guaranteed this year. Only $3 million of that guaranteed for 2024. So all that being said, Josh, I felt like Okorafor, most games he was solid, did his job, was okay, but he was kind of, but I felt like in the other side of that, his okay was more negative than positive. And I think that was the biggest drawback for a guy that they paid a really good contract for to keep around.
It's time to make my one reference of the show. We're going to season 2 of
movie reference.
Actually, it's this TV. It's season 2 of The Wire. There were times when I looked at Chukwuma Okorafor and he felt like Sergey from season 2 of The Wire. At the end of the season, where everybody kept calling him Boris, and he's like, Boris, why always Boris? There were times when certain plays would happen, and I would see it was Chukwuma Okorafor, and I'd just be thinking, Chooks. Why always Chooks? That's how it felt sometimes. And it was particularly on some running plays where you might find him maybe 3 or 4 yards in the backfield right off the ball, where he just got completely blown up. I mean, there were times when, and honestly, I can't single him out because there were some times when Dan Moore was guilty of this too, where you're seeing Najee Harris not even getting to the line of scrimmage and he's got a tackle in his lap. And that becomes a problem. And I keep trying to tell people, they're like, oh, well, Najee didn't look good. I'm like, yeah, because he's trying to dodge his own guy and he's trying to dodge the other team. That goes against the purpose. So I feel the same way you do, that there were some times when you're going, hey, why do we keep seeing this from Chooks in this part of the season? And that there are some things that really need to be cleared up. On the salary side of things, and as far as his cap hit, I feel like next year is a poo or get off the pot year for him.
Yeah.
I feel like they're going to have to restructure some of that money, because not only because I don't think they're willing to give that out to him because his performance hasn't reflected it, but if they're trying to put some cap space together to bring some other guys on this team to make it better in the short term and long term, they're going to need to do some readjustments, and he's probably one of the early candidates to do it. But I feel like next year is a poo or get off the pot year for him. I think he has to show that he belongs here and that he's going to earn that last year that you're talking about with only $3 million guaranteed. But he's got to prove he belongs in 2023, or there may be no 2024 for Chukwuma Okorafor. Yeah. And I think it is really up to him to decide whether he stays or whether he goes.
And I agree with that sentiment. I also think because of his age, because remember, he was 25 years old this year,
right, with
4 years of experience. So like, he's a vet. Like, he's a vet. Like, he's been around. He's seen the things, But I look at him, and this was his 5th season. He's got his 6th season coming up next year, when he'll be 26 years old. I think the Steelers could be in a unique position with Okorafor to say, hey, you know what? we're going to restructure your contract. We're going to move some of the money that isn't dead money into 2024. And you know what? If you perform really well, we will, you'll get that money then, and we'll sign you to another extension because you'll only be 27 and you'll be you'll be a piece of the offensive line that the Steelers project moving forward. But you are right. I think they do need to emphasize, like, look, you need more than this if you're making that kind of money on this roster. And I think they paid him that money also to keep a veteran presence on the offensive line, because really they didn't have any going into this season. If you looked at the guys across the board, Mason Cole and James Daniels were new to the team. Kevin Dotson had not been a consistent starter. Dan Moore was coming off his rookie year where he was getting beat a lot. They needed some guy to do that. And I think Chukwuma Okorafor fulfilled that role. But now it's like, okay, the offensive line's getting better. You got to get better with it. And we'll see if he does going into next year and how that plays into the contract structure. All in all, I think the offensive line, just looking back at this was the chart that I kind of kept track of, where all my stars and skulls, if there's a negative there, it means it's a skull. If there's a plus, if there's nothing there, because there's no pluses on the sheet, that means it was a star. But you can see kind of just overall here, Josh, a lot of those positive numbers came in that second half, really building forward, especially with Cole, Daniels, and Dotson up the middle. And I think it makes it even a little bit clearer if the Steelers are going to go anywhere on the offensive line next year, early in the draft with the 17th overall pick or the 32nd overall pick, it might just be offensive tackle.
I wouldn't rule out tackle, and I wouldn't rule out maybe left guard either. But
I wouldn't rule it out.
There has to be some depth added to this group, and partially because you said it, not only because the talent level needs to be raised, but also because you said it. This group went all 17 games together. Mm-hmm. Yep. And you talk to any offensive line coach, they'll tell you never expect to have all five of your guys for a full season. What this group did as far as just being healthy and available, I'm not talking about level of play. I'm not talking about results on the field. I'm talking about just the fact that these five guys stayed healthy for 17 games. That is unheard of. Not to mention the fact it's the first 17-game season. So that's probably kind of a milestone in and of itself, maybe a historic thing, if you will. But it does say a lot for the fact that these guys were available for 17 games. And if you're looking at that happening this year, you got to expect someone's going to miss some time next year, if only because of the law of averages. Because like you said, we're talking about a very difficult position. We're talking about the most violent position on the field, where you are literally hitting someone on every play, or you're getting hit on every play. So you have to be a little bit more, prepared for the fact that injuries are going to occur. So there definitely needs to be depth added as far as guys getting hurt or losing people. And there's probably going to need to be some depth added in terms of raising this overall quality of play too, because a little infusion of talent, I think, could take this group a lot further.
Absolutely. We'll see what kind of talent they want to infuse into this group, and we'll have more grades coming out. This was just the beginning. We'll be keeping that up as the year goes, as the offseason rolls along. This is the Thursday episode of the Locked On Steelers podcast. Friday, we'll have Jenna Horner back, getting you ready for the wild card weekend and talking some more Pittsburgh Steelers. Josh, thanks so much for joining us. Appreciate you as always. Let people know they can find you, follow you, and get more of your work.
Social media, Josh Taylor HD. On the TV side, cbspittsburgh.com. That goes for both KDKA and Pittsburgh CW. Radio side, 93.7 The Fan. You can listen on the Odyssey app, just like you listen to the Locked On Steelers podcast. So after you're done listening to the show, check me out on 93.7 The Fan. I'll be up this upcoming Sunday from noon to 2:30, and then the following Tuesday, 6 to 10:35. At some point, you'll probably hear Chris at some point talking with me too. So definitely check that out, because this guy will be here with me at some point or another. We'll be discussing some Steelers and probably some college hoops, because that's what we do too.
Absolutely. Check us out there. Another 3.7 The Fan. We're looking forward to it, Josh. Check me out, Chris Carter, at Twitter and Instagram at Carter Critiques. You can also check me out, the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, where I cover Pitt hoops along with Pitt football and all things Pitt athletics. Also, you can check me out here on the Locked On Steelers podcast every day, Monday through Friday, breaking things down on your Pittsburgh Steelers. Back tomorrow talking more about your Pittsburgh Steelers right here on the Locked On Steelers podcast.